What about the Greens? I think they're economically reactionary. And this represents a real problem, I think, for their overall agenda. I think they're utopian on international policy and international politics generally. They've got great enthusiasm. They've got great insight. And I think we should recognise that. But when it comes to the politics of climate change, I don't think they offer a future. So let's go back to social democracy. What has it got that can really contribute to this issue of climate change politics? We know the sorts of policies that we're going to need to move to a low-carbon economy. A mix of taxation measures, new regulation, investment in research, renewable energy, etc., etc. We know, generally speaking, where we're going on the policy front. What we need is a strategy. And you can't build a strategy to go to a low-carbon economy unless at the heart of that strategy is social justice. And I agree with Wolfgang's point about that being a central feature of social democratic politics. What we're going to need is a distribution of the burdens and benefits that go with a move to a low-carbon economy that is fair. Because that is going to be the only basis upon which we're going to bring people with us on this road to a society based upon a low-carbon economy that has the ability to sustain the world and avoid some of the consequences that the scientists have told us about, and Lord Stern and the economists have told us about, and Alan DuPont and the political scientists and international relations people have told us about. Serious consequences for the world. So it's my judgment that despite their energy, their enthusiasm, their insight, the Greens can't take us there. It's my view that the Conservatives won't take us there. A pity, but they won't. What we need is a strategy. We need the sort of social cement that social democracy gave to capitalism when it was under attack from fascism on the one side and communism on the other. It was held together by social democratic policies. We need social justice in the distribution of the burdens and benefits involved in the realisation of a low-carbon economy. That means international cooperation in policy and implementation. It means an interest in and a support for international institutions at the regional and global level. That means social democracy. It must also mean, however, leadership and interest in the many issues that trouble our society. Social democrats can't avoid all of these issues. Citizenship and engagement. In fact, Wolfgang mentioned many of them. Citizenship and engagement, rights and responsibilities, the proper regulation of finance, life in our suburbs, life in our cities, health, well-being, multiculturalism, social dysfunction, social disadvantage. Social democrats should be agents of effective public policy. They should be the agents of harm minimisation. They should be the agents of real change in our community that respects the individual. And when a radical response is required, social democrats should be at the front of the game. They become too conservative on questions where the public is waiting for a lead. Gay marriage, obvious example of that. Others like euthanasia, issues like drug reform. Only last week I heard someone from the Soros Foundation talking about the complete failure of our policies in these areas. When I was in politics for 20 years, parent after parent, what are we going to do about this? What are we going to do about this issue? Our policies have failed. We need to be at the forefront of new thinking on these questions. Issues like congestion charges in our city. Now, this may be too much for a political movement that exhausted a lot of its leadership and a lot of its energy in that huge process of reorganising capitalist economies in the post-communist era. A lot of energy, a lot of leadership required in that. And social democrats almost reduced themselves to methodologies, techniques, rather than people with a mission. But my view is quite simple. It's a movement whose power and status may have been dented, but whose role and influence are going to be absolutely crucial because of the link that can be drawn between the move to a low-carbon economy and social justice. That's the link that social democrats need to put right up front in their thinking and their policies, backed up by a program that deals with the issues that people are raising to them in their communities and in their suburbs, and being radical when necessary in that process. If we are to meet the challenges of our times, social democracy is going to be absolutely crucial. We've got a period where there's global instability, fundamentalism, financial failure, economic realignment. The steadying force of social democracy is going to be essential. If it's not there, I fear for the future of our world. Thank you very much.
I'm extremely pleased to say two hard acts to follow. I thank both speakers, as a person who's been involved in the organisation of this event, very much for two extremely stimulating addresses. I also would thank you all for coming. This is the first event that my little Ideas in Society unit has run downtown, and it was a sort of test as to whether we could draw an audience, and I'm extremely grateful for you coming tonight. Because I've organised my talk without knowing what Wolfgang or Jeff were to say, some themes will coincide, some will differ, but I'm not deft enough to change as I on the spot. And indeed, I'm too stubborn to do so. Let me start like this. When we speak of social democracy, we can mean, I think, one of two main things. We can mean by social democracy the present-day representatives of certain historical parties. These were the Democratic Socialist or Labour parties, which were members of the Second International after the First World War, which were fiercely opposed to the communist parties of the Comintern or Third International. These parties sought to overthrow capitalism then by a non-revolutionary method, by linking the aim of socialism to representative democracy and the rule of law. After the Second World War, these parties gradually lost faith in centrally planned and socially owned economies and made an historic compromise with capitalism, first in fact and then in theory, gradually transforming themselves from the democratic socialist parties of the post-war period into the social democratic parties of today. But we can also mean by social democracy something rather different, and this Jeff has talked about, a particular and distinctive era in the history of the West, stretching from the end of the Second World War until the election of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, 1979 and 1980. In this era, social democracy stood, I think, for four main things. For Keynesian policies based on the belief that macroeconomic intervention by the state had the capacity to prevent the return of mass unemployment of the kind seen in the Great Depression. Secondly, mixed economies, as they were called, of both public ownership and private enterprise. Thirdly, steeply progressive taxation. Fourthly, and most importantly of all, the elaboration or even the creation of the protective social welfare state. The social democratic era was capitalism's golden age, where ordinary people were delivered life chances and security of a kind never previously seen in history. The era was fashioned by the policies of the social democratic parties, but supported with only slightly less enthusiasm by the liberal, conservative and Christian democratic parties of the centre-right or the centre. In essence, it was the stagflation crisis of the mid-70s that brought the era of social democracy, but not, of course, the social democratic parties, to an end. Stagflation undermined confidence in Keynesianism, which was premised on the belief that inflation and stagnation were the alternative illnesses to which the capitalist economy might succumb. Once that confidence was gone, the social democratic era was succeeded by what I call the era of neoliberalism, with Friedrich Hayek rather than Maynard Keynes its presiding spirit. In this new era, belief in the efficacy of government intervention was replaced by faith in the magic of the free market. Belief in the mixed public-private economy was replaced by enthusiasm for privatisation. Belief in progressive taxation was replaced by pursuit of a low-tax regime. Belief in the welfare state was replaced by a small government enthusiasm, more in theory, in fact, than in practice, and by scepticism about the economic, social, and even moral costs of the so-called nanny state. Neoliberalism in this era was embraced by all Western societies to some degree. It brought everywhere increasing wealth, but also greater levels of inequality, especially in those societies where neoliberalism was most deeply entrenched, in the United Kingdom, but especially in the United States. During the Keynesian era, CEOs in the US earned approximately 25 to 30 times the salaries of their workers. On the eve of the Great Recession of 2008, they earned 300 to 500 times as much. The great Social Democrat Orwell thought 10 to 1 was the maximum that was morally justifiable. In the 1970s, the richest 1% of Americans owned 20% of their country. On the eve of the Great Recession, they owned 40%. Seems to me an astonishing development. Momentarily, the coming of the Great Recession in 2008, which was caused in essence, I believe, by the unregulated and frenzied global trade in esoteric financial products known as derivatives, appeared to have signalled the end of the neoliberal era. Intellectually honest neoliberals, like the former president of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, felt what he called shocked disbelief at the manifest failure of his faith. Distinguished contemporary social democrats like Paul Krugman or Joseph Stiglitz were convinced that the neoliberal ideological fantasy about the magic of the free market would now be certain to be discredited. Yet, so far at least, the global financial crisis this discrediting has not come to pass. Since 2008, we have seen not a discrediting of neoliberalism and a return to social democracy or the left, but the rise in the United States of the most primitive form of small government, right-wing populist paranoia in the Tea Party movement, and the weakening in Europe of the social democratic parties and the idea of the welfare state. The puzzling and counterintuitive political response to the global financial crisis is, I think, one of the most important contemporary questions we need to try and understand. The strategic problem facing the social democratic parties, including the Australian Labor Party, can best be described in this way. The basic supporters of the social democratic parties have been, on the one hand, the working classes and less affluent middle class, and on the other, since the 1970s, the left-leaning members of the well-educated and well-heeled professional class. In recent years, however, the social democratic parties have lost some of their more impoverished supporters among the shrinking working class to the xenophobic populist parties of the right. They have lost some of their more affluent working class supporters to the small government, low-tax neoliberal parties. And they have lost very many of their left-leaning inner-city professional supporters to the new parties of the Greens. As a result of this simultaneous loss of votes to the right and to the left, the political dilemma facing these parties has become acute. On the one hand, if they compete with the populist and neoliberal right for the working class votes they are losing, they are increasingly abandoned by their left-leaning middle-class constituency who move to the Greens. Of course, this is what is happening now in Australia. If, on the other hand, they compete with the Greens for the professional middle-class votes they are losing, they risk a further loss of both the downwardly and upwardly mobile working classes to the parties of the populist and the neoliberal right. Only a fool would pretend that the crisis of social democracy can be easily resolved. There are, in my view, and I'm here now speaking more from hope than confidence, there are two main questions that will determine whether social democracy has a future. The empirical data presented in the seminal recent book, The Spirit Level, makes it clear that in recent decades, in the far more equal social democracies of Northwest and Central Europe, almost every social indicator of significance, health, mental well-being, social mobility, educational achievement, commission of serious crime, every indicator is markedly more positive than in the radically unequal, really existing neoliberal democracies of the United Kingdom, but especially the United States. Neoliberalism is concerned primarily with political and economic freedom, social democracy with the question of how the values of both freedom and equality can be reconciled and pursued. If social democracy is then to revive, it will be in part because the humanly superior social performance of the European social democracies comes eventually to be recognised. In such a revival, the role of the social democratic parties will be to convince sufficient numbers of citizens that there is still vital work to be done by the state, and this I agree very much with Wolfgang, removing those parts of the welfare state which are indefensible or dysfunctional, but also adding tasks for the welfare state so far ignored. It is wrong, I think, to think the welfare state is complete and can only be defended. In Australia, we have truly scandalous situation in regard to mental health provision, dental health, disability, and of course the remote Indigenous communities, which require more than money, but they require serious thought, but they also do require money. In order to do this in the ideological sphere, the task of the social democratic parties will be to mount a long-term intellectual challenge to the presently hegemonic, low-tax, small-government, neoliberal rhetoric of contemporary politics and, of course, the contemporary right. Whether that can happen, God only knows, but we've all been saying predictions are difficult to make. There is, however, an even more important question, which in my view will determine whether or not social democracy has a future. Climate scientists tell us that unless human beings radically reduce their consumption of fossil fuels, not in the long term, but immediately, the future of the Earth is in peril. Although it is true that in placing the question of radical action on climate change at the centre of their agenda, the social democratic parties will risk losing the support of part of the traditional working class clientele. Because of the gravity and immediacy of the climate change question, I cannot see how they can avoid the conclusion that as a matter of principle, their future rests in doing so, in making climate change centre to their agenda. I sort of half agree with Jeff and half disagree, as my next remarks will show. If this is right, it follows that the future of social democracy rests in a relationship of what one might call competitive collaboration with the Greens. In such an imagined future, there are certain vital tasks that the social democratic parties can play in this imagined competitive collaboration. Because of their history, the social democratic parties are vital to convincing broad public opinion that radical action on climate change is part of the political mainstream. That's the advantage of their tradition. And because of their linkage to the working classes, which still remains, they also have a vital role to play in devising policies to ensure that action against climate change will not favour the more affluent members of society at the expense of the less affluent. And that's the part that I agree with Jeff. During the Cold War, in collaboration with Liberals and Conservatives, the social democratic parties unmasked the fundamental illusion of the left, namely that the future belonged to communism. In the present age, this time in collaboration with the Greens, their role will be, I hope, to unmask the fundamental illusions of the right, namely that the market will solve our problems for us and that accelerating consumption offers the key to the attainment of the good life. And here I agree with remarks that Wolfgang made. The social democratic era represented the response of Western nations to the threat of a return to mass unemployment of the kind seen in the Great Depression and to the rise of fascist savagery. And these challenges together called into question the very idea of European civilization. In my view, it was social democracy in the era that met that challenge best. Our age faces an altogether different but no less serious civilizational challenge, catastrophic climate change. In my view, if social democracy has a future, it will have not only to defend its earlier welfare state achievements and extend them, but rise to this diabolically difficult new challenge by becoming, from the viewpoint of its tradition, almost unrecognisably green. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Robert. Well, it's my task to think about some of the questions and issues these three terrific speakers raised, and ask a couple of questions of them in turn, and then we'll open it up to the audience, because I'm sure you would all love to ask questions of each of them. When Jeff Gallup was giving his rousing address, he'd mentioned studying at Oxford, and it built up with such sort of momentum that I thought we were sort of in the Oxford Union debates, and I was going to say, you won, you know. All three speakers are clearly worried about the future of social democracy and whether it has a future. And all three, in their different ways, pointed to the new or not so new divisions that have opened up in our society. Divisions of class, of wealth, of generation, although no one mentioned that particularly, but it seems to me there's clearly a generation gap as well when we're looking at the success of the Greens versus the Labor Party. And at the same time, historically, social democratic politics or Labor politics, historically, which I think in Australia go back much further than World War II, their success was built on a certain sense of social solidarity, and as often as not, ethnic or racial solidarity in our history. These were the underpinnings of that social solidarity. Now we don't seem to have that ready social solidarity anymore, and as I said, all speakers emphasised the sort of divisions that beset us. So I guess I would like to ask them all, and perhaps particularly starting with Jeff, after his rousing advocacy of the future of the Social Democratic Party, how he envisages that, and it comes back to a point Robert made right at the end. How does he envisage the Australian Labor Party being reformed in such a radical way as to restore faith, as to be inspiring again? Because I think it's not just that people have gone off to the left and the right, is that most people, I think, have completely lost faith in the capacity of the Australian Labor Party to renew itself, to inspire. And we know from the figures, you know, it's lost, like a lot of social democratic parties, members, drastically from the membership it used to have. So if I could ask you first, Jeff, how do you imagine that the ALP is going to renew itself in that way you promised us?
Well, that's a difficult question. There's no doubt that one way would be to see some successes coming through from bolder initiatives in politics. I think at the moment, because of the election result, Labor's in an alliance with independents to some extent, and will increasingly be after July with the Greens. And, you know, they need some runs on the board for some of the more radical things that they're proposing, such as to deal with this carbon question. And I think there needs to be some momentum created on the policy front which would help build confidence around those things. Secondly, there's a whole lot of issues about the structure of the Labor Party, how it operates. Rodney Cavalier, my friend up in Sydney, has just published a book on some of these questions, on how we can try and improve the basis of pre-selection. We ought to be considering some broader mechanism by which we select candidates to go into Parliament. But in the end, I think it will be the reality dawning upon people who are currently active at the parliamentary level that, they need to go in this direction, because if they don't, they will slowly but surely die on the vine. And I think there's nothing like political reality to be a spur to action. So I think, getting some runs on the board, particularly on the carbon tax in the next couple of years, very important that be done effectively as part of hopefully a wider renewal of interest in the question internationally. Secondly, some reform within the ranks of the Labor Party about how it selects its candidates. And I think also, just thirdly, the realisation that holding the line will mean going backwards rather than forwards.
Okay, thanks. Now, just one question to the other two, and that is how you both talked about possibilities of green social democrat, green Labour coalitions. How or not, and you both talked about Wolfgang in particular emphasised class divisions and class distinctions, and particularly the political alliance of different class distinctions. And Robert also talked about political divisions, working class, professional class, whatever. How can you give us an idea of what could be the basis of a new sense of social solidarity and a new sense of social cohesion that actually, might serve to heal some of those divisions or to bring people together? So perhaps Wolfgang and then Robert.
I do agree what Jeff said, that social justice has to be combined with a policy of managing climate change. This is the first point. And then you must organize a fair burden sharing. It will do at first some, will have some negative effects on the classical industrial sectors. Not everything will be, again, only green technology. This is the first part. And the second one is there should be a coalition of Greens and Social Democrats, but it should be a competitive collaboration. I find this quite intriguing, and if you combine both, this could be another step. However, I'm a bit afraid that social democratic parties could be the losers, because the Greens are in these future-oriented issues where they address especially a well-educated middle-class audience. And the Social Democrats, again, have the unthankful job to address the lowest third of the society, the losers, if one can say it. And this is no longer the working class. This is what in Europe has been called the underclass. They cannot be easily organized. But if you want to have a fair society, they have to be brought in. So such a coalition, I would say, is unavoidable, but it is not clear how the Social Democrats can avoid to be the losing part in such a competitive collaboration.
Okay, thanks. Robert, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, to me, if we put the question slightly differently, what is the future of human beings? That seems to me to trump the question of what does social democracy have a future, and for that reason I think that it's critical that the two parties basically of the left, the Social Democrats and the Greens, together form a kind of de facto coalition, because I think the question of climate change is so pressing. The scientists might be wrong, but I can't see that it's rational to think that. In which case, I think there is work, I was trying to say, work for Social Democrats to do. I don't think they should be particularly fazed if they lose votes to the well-educated professional middle class to some extent, because I think they should work towards a majority with the Greens. In fact, they won't never say that. I mean, Australia is the case I know best. If there is lack of ambivalence about the relationship between Labor and the Greens, there is a chance, I think, for those two parties to build something like the basis for government. And I think the Social Democrats, as I tried to say, partly will be trusted more because of their history of managing economies and having a long history of not being economically flaky. So it's probably a good thing if they take, what we call the Treasury and you call Minister of Finance. But also I think that one of the points I was trying to make is that the welfare state is not finished as far as I can see. I think, and I'll make it very concrete. If in Australia, and I don't know what Germany is like, but if in Australia you happen to have a mentally ill child, your life is turned into a misery, in part because it's a miserable thing, but in part because the state does virtually nothing to help you. The same with disability. It seems to me absolutely scandalous, given the cost of dentists, that working people can't afford to go to the dentist because of the failure of the welfare state. In other words, I think there are all sorts of things that the Social Democrats can do to extend the achievements of the welfare state, to get rid of the parts that are unviable. I mean, Tony Judt discusses in his wonderful book the impossibility of the retirement age, when people did physical work and they needed to retire at 60 or 62 or even 65. Many people now don't do work that destroys them physically. They can work longer. And there are all sorts of things, I think, that could be reformed within the welfare state. But I must say, for the Social Democrats to have a future, a serious future, I think it rests on combating low-tax ideology. And I mean, Jeff must know a lot about this because he was the Premier of Western Australia. But even the moderate left now speaks about low tax. Here we had a basically sensible tax suggestion for the mining tax, and all the Conservative leader had to say was a great big new tax, and the issue was sort of resolved in the. So there is not really just for parties, but for intellectuals, I think, to fight a long battle, almost as serious as the climate change battle, to change the rhetoric about levels of taxation.
And I think, Robert, you could link that, though, with, let's just take dentistry, you mentioned. I was on the Health Commission, and we reported last year, and we recommended that the Australian government provide dentistry at a certain level as of right to all people, but they are able to choose the insurance fund through which that policy would be delivered, to try to build some individual responsibility and individual choice alongside the right, very much a European, model of, insurance-based welfare state. So I think it's important. I agree with you on tax. If I can just tell one story, in the first year of my government, I introduced a property tax on a land tax on all private homes over $1 million, thinking this was a wonderful Henry George initiative, sharing the wealth of Western Australia. Not only did we have huge opposition from those who you'd normally expect, Labor Party branches were opposing it. So, I agree with you on tax, but it is a long haul and a hard issue, but we need to keep chipping away at it. And, obviously the current failure v. the mining tax is a real problem for Social Democrats, and they're going to have to work their way through that issue. So I think we must make sure, and I think a lot of what Robert called neoliberal, particularly, using the market as an effective mechanism and giving more power to individuals and to communities, I think should be part of the package. I mean, this microcredit thing in third world countries has been a brilliant initiative. We've seen the debate over the banks emphasise credit unions again. I think these sorts of traditions where we have a plurality of economic institutions in our society, rather than just one big, state-delivered program, I think ought to be part of that agenda if we're going to win people. The neoliberal agenda wasn't totally without its value. That's what I would argue.
Okay, time's rushing on.
No.
I think it's absolutely true that the welfare state we should see as unfinished business rather than something that was in the past. We'll throw it open now to the audience. So who would like to ask a question? Yes, I can see a hand there.
Okay, my question is directed primarily to Jeff. You indicated that social democracy can be very effective in dealing with climate change. And yet, if we look at the record of the ALP here in Australia, it doesn't look very good. So, for example, if the CPRS had passed, I'm not sure how much difference it would have made, because it had weak targets, lots of exemptions, free permits. At the same time, Labor governments continue to support the erection or the construction of coal-fired power plants and support the shipment of coal to China and other Asian countries and so forth. So I wonder how you respond to that.
Well, there's no doubt that the failure to achieve the emissions trading system was, I think, a serious blow. And I would disagree with you. And I've had this discussion with Bob Brown and others in the Greens and say, well, wait, we'll get something better. Look, social change is a very difficult process. To create a new set of institutions around a carbon market, I think, would have been a huge breakthrough for our country. Now, you would argue that targets were too low, the price wasn't right, you can have all those arguments. But that would have been a huge move forward, institutional change of that sort. And imagine the politics of the country. I mean, with Malcolm Turnbull supporting it, there would have been a consensus on these issues. So I think the Greens made a huge mistake for our nation by opposing that, even though, obviously, it may not be the best system ever invented by human history. to deal with this issue. I really like the British approach of legislating. I think their Climate Change Act is a wonderful piece of legislation that's going to put accountability into their system. So no one's perfect in this, and I certainly believe that the backing away from emissions trading, the fateful decision that Kevin Rudd made, was a very bad decision, and I've said so on many occasions. But I don't agree with you that it was something not worth having. I really think that would have moved us forward.
And how about the coal-fired power plants and the shipping of coal overseas, the continuing support for that, because those are major sources of greenhouse gas emissions.
The greenhouse gas emissions come from all sorts of sources. There's our electricity system, there's our transport system, there's deforestation all around the world. And we've got to come up, as I've said and Wolfgang said and Robert said, we've got to distribute the burdens associated with the move to a low-carbon economy in a way that can keep a majority of the people with us. Otherwise it won't happen. So I think the policy of banning exports of coal is silly, and I don't think it would work in terms of moving Australia forward in the direction of a low-carbon economy. It would immediately create, I think, a division in our society that would not allow that position to move forward in a sustainable way.
Could I very briefly say, if one's talking practical politics, then of course Jeff is right about the coal industry. If, however, one's talking about the future of the planet, which seems to me to have, and human civilization, then I'm with James Hansen of NASA, which is that the burning of coal is the major problem, and the major solution is, in the reasonably short future, to stop burning coal. Now, our problem as human beings, it seems to me, is that we operate in parallel universes. One is the universe of practical politics, and the other is the universe of a warming planet. And I think the biggest trick in politics is to try and make them not parallel universes but come together. And, boy, do I know it's not easy. But I wanted to say...
I certainly agree with the move to a natural gas-based energy system as a transition fuel, given the resources we have in Australia, and have advocated that. But I just think the notion put forward by the Speaker was a clear point you made. Let's ban the export of coal. I think that would not be an agenda item that would be sustainable.
Maybe it helps to distinguish between short-term and longer-term goals in politics. And this is what I meant before. If Social Democrats would now immediately go onto a ban on exporting coal, it would cost jobs. It would cost jobs here. There is no doubt about it. This would harm social democratic parties. It would not harm that much the Green Party. And therefore I was arguing there are so many reasons that we should engage intensively in a shift of our industrial economy more to a knowledge economy. And we have the resources. Therefore, investments in research and education are crucial. But in the short term, there are trade-offs, and I'm afraid that the Social Democratic Party will face many more trade-offs than such a more single-issue party as the Greens will face.
Okay, now do we have some more questions?
My question relates to the social base, talking about the social base. But as a prelude to that, let me just say that the good news is that the debate between the small state and the large state is actually over in practice. All parties are for a large state. The only difference is that the Conservatives use the state differently and parcel the money out to other people. But if you actually look at taxation levels, they haven't really changed for 20, 30 years now. 30, 33%, maybe a little bit more now that we've taken a lot off the books by taking it into privatisation. But that takes me back to the social base. The question I would ask is, when Social Democrats are next back in power, what policies can they pursue to build up and create that social base, those social movements that will sustain this? Because at the moment, as Robert pointed out, every time you come out with these policies, you have to face an ideological push against the powers that be. The state works to ameliorate or protect people from the effects of the capitalist system as it goes about its business. It's more radical now because it's more globalised. Both sides of politics use the state to protect the people that they look after from that. Capitalism in Australia is primarily about, or conservatism in Australia is primarily about protecting the interests that are currently in power. that's not the social democratic agenda. It's actually more democratising, and it's also about building up that social base. So to cut short what's become too much of a long question stroke comment, what would you suggest Social Democrats should do when they're next in power to do something about building up and creating a sustainable social base?
This is, if I would have an answer, then probably I would be a well-paid advisor to social democratic governments. This is one of the crucial questions, and here I'm more skeptical than maybe Jeff is. One has to see that the working class constitutes only 20% in Europe, in UK only 15% of the overall employment. You cannot win elections with them. And the underclass, which is, so to say, 1/3 of the society or 20% of the society, are those who are not even sometimes integrated into the labor market, and they do not vote very often. They are out of politics, out of democratic participation. Therefore, and we did some, therefore I'm the firm conviction that there will be an electoral decline. There will be not a return to the 50s, 60s, and 70s, meaning that social democratic parties can gain electoral results very much beyond 30%. It is something different in your majoritarian Westminster models, where you have a first past the post system, which protects to some extent the big parties. You don't have it in proportional representational system, which we have normally in Europe, where you have a pluralization of parties. No longer 2 or 3 parties. We have 5, 6, 7 parties. And even coalitions then will be 3 and 4 parties. So it will be a more turbulent time, and the solid base cannot be easily recreated. Therefore, I argue there will be a future for social democratic policies and goals and for just society, but it's not sure whether social democratic parties will be the major actors in it.
Can I just say a tiny thing on that? Just Wolfgang is a European, not an Australian. We actually don't have first past the post system, but a preferential system, which is complicated. But it actually makes it, I think, more easy to think about collaborative competition, because the direction of preferences is one of the critical political matters in each election. I do think one thing, so it is much more possible here than in Europe to put together something like 50%. Because of it's basically a 2-party system with a third party now playing a role. I think to some extent you will win a part of the public if you argue for certain propositions well. That may sound too idealistic, but I don't believe that electors would be deaf to a really good mental health policy. I don't think they'd be deaf to a really good disability policy. I don't think they'd be deaf to a fairly redistributed burden flowing from action on climate change. Our polls suggest public opinion knows that something has to be done. In other words, I think there is a sort of, with outside the mechanics of our analysis, there is also a role for something like taking citizens seriously and thinking that they can make judgments on what morally matters and what matters from the point of view of well-being and the common future.
And could I add to that? A great question, by the way, and that is that, how do we build a constituency if you're on the social democratic side? One point worth making is just the power of government to do good things. Now, at the moment, social democrats have been losing that power, and one of the criticisms of them is that they haven't used that power as effectively as they might. But what is interesting, and I tried to sort of hint at this in my talk, there are lots of issues in contemporary politics. There are lots of issues that are just not on the agenda of the Social Democrats. The Greens have them on there. And as I said, there's a lot of enthusiasm and insight in the Greens. And don't get me wrong in terms of my view, I don't think they can lead us to the future. But I do think there's a lot of energy there, and competitive collaboration is a great concept, I think. But there are lots of issues. Social dysfunction, social disadvantage, making sure our education system really delivers equal opportunity. In Australia, we found on the Health Commission that people with disability in Australia are dramatically less in the workforce than they are in European countries. What's going on? Why is it that our education system isn't providing that equal opportunity? So there's a lot of things that Labor can argue in the electorate that would attract people, I think, in terms of their overall commitments to a better society. But there are a lot of things going the other way as well. So I think the real test would be being adventurous in government. And, you know, it really strikes me on this gay marriage thing that they've really got the wrong end of the sauce bottle or whatever it is on this one, you know, to use a Kevin Ruddism. What is it? Anyway, they could lead the debate on that.
We've just about run out of time. Would you like to ask a question?
You've touched on, you know, social democracy in domestic affairs, but considering we have Wolfgang here with us, the state of social democracy in the international scene, and we like to think of social democracy in relation to human rights and a continuing globalized world. So if you could just comment on the future of social democracy on an international level, and whether it's, I certainly see it as something that has some beauty in it, in us understanding ourselves as a common human kind, if you'd like. So,
one has to remember that social democrats and socialist parties in Europe do not have, or did not have for quite a long time, a particular foreign policy. Always when it came to foreign policies, the differences between the conservatives and social democrats disappeared to some extent. However, there was a time, so to say, the golden age at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, and where Willy Brandt, for example, in Germany, was one of the founders and the major proponent for the North-South Commission. And this means they translated to some extent what they have to do on the domestic level, being the protector of those who are not very privileged. They have to transform it on the international level as well, meaning they have to become more visible, the protector of human rights. And climate change has an international dimension as well. So there are things to do. However, up to now, social democrats did not have this wonderful, so to say, just socially oriented foreign policy. I just remind on the foreign policy of Tony Blair. It was not really distinguishable what George W. Bush did. So national interests are overriding and did override to some extent the values and goals of social democracy on the international level. There has to be something done. Whether this pays dramatically in electoral terms on the national levels, I have certain doubts. However, social democrats would gain also on the national scene more credibility to be on the side of the weaker, to be on the side, so to say, of those who have to be protected.
Okay, well, I think we might now bring this to an end, so if you join me in thanking our speakers very much.